Every century produces artists who know how to paint. They study the rules. They master the techniques. They learn which colors belong next to which, how light falls on fabric, how to make a face look like a face and a body look like a body. They are craftsmen of the highest order. Their names appear in museum catalogs. Their work hangs in galleries where people walk slowly and nod. And then there are the ones who paint something else entirely. Not surfaces, not appearances, not the pleasant arrangement of colors on a canvas. They paint time. They paint grief. They paint the specific, unrepeatable weight of a single human life. Rembrandt van Rijn was that kind of painter. He was born in Leiden in 1606, the ninth child of a miller, in a country that had been fighting for its independence for 40 years. He died in Amsterdam in 1669, in poverty, stripped of almost everything he had accumulated in a long and extraordinary life. Between those two dates, he produced somewhere between 300 and 350 paintings, nearly 300 etchings, and somewhere around 2,000 drawings. The numbers are staggering, but numbers are not the point. The point is what those works contain. Rembrandt painted the human face more times, and with more psychological depth, than any artist before or since. He painted himself over 90 times across 6 decades. As a young man full of bravado, as a successful portrait painter at the height of his fame, as a middle-aged man beginning to lose his footing, and as an old man, looking into a mirror with an honesty so unsparing that it makes you feel you are intruding on something private. The self-portraits alone constitute one of the greatest sustained acts of self-examination in human history. They are not vanity. They are reckoning. He also painted grief with a specificity that no other artist has matched. Not grief as a pose, not grief as a compositional element, not grief as a way to make a painting seem important. Actual grief. The grief of a man who watched his wife die young, who watched his son outlive him by only a few months, who watched his fortune dissolve, his reputation fracture, his city move on without him, and who kept painting through all of it, not despite what happened to him, because of it. This is Art and Ashes. My name is your guide through the dark hours. And tonight, we are going to Leiden in 1606, and then to Amsterdam, and then into the studio of the greatest painter of light and shadow the world has ever produced. We are going to talk about what he made, and what it cost him, and what it cost the people who loved him. And we're going to talk about what remains, which is everything. If you are new here, subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us where you are listening from and what brought you to a story about Rembrandt tonight. Every comment gets read, every single one. To understand Rembrandt, you have to begin not in Amsterdam, where the myth was made, but in Leiden, in 1606, in a country still discovering what it was. The Dutch Republic at the beginning of the 17th century was one of the most remarkable political experiments in human history. It had declared independence from Habsburg Spain in 1581, not because it had the military strength to force the issue, but because it had the commercial and ideological coherence to sustain the fight. The Dutch had decided that they were a nation of merchants and Protestants, and that neither the Spanish crown nor the Catholic Church had any business telling them how to organize either enterprise. The result was a society unlike anything else in Europe. There was no king. There was no established church with the power to burn heretics. There was a merchant class that had accumulated wealth on a scale that astonished visitors from across the continent, and that spent that wealth with a voracious appetite for painting, not the grand religious cycles that decorated Italian churches, not the heroic mythological canvases that filled royal palaces, paintings of themselves, of their houses, their wives, their kitchens, their gardens, paintings that said, "We exist, we matter, and we have the money to prove it." Leiden, where Rembrandt was born, was one of the great intellectual centers of this new republic. Its university, founded in 1575 as a reward for the city's heroic resistance to a Spanish siege, was already one of the most respected in Europe. Leiden was a city of weavers and scholars, of Calvinist churches and Latin disputations, of practical intelligence and serious intellectual ambition. Into this world, Rembrandt Harmen van Rijn was born on July 15th, 1606. His father, Harmen Gerritzoen van Rijn, operated a malt mill on the bank of the Rhine. That is where the family name comes from, Van Rijn, meaning from the Rhine. His mother, Neeltgen Willemsdochter van Zuidbroek, was the daughter of a baker. They were a solid, prosperous working family, not wealthy by the standards of the merchant elite, but stable, literate, and serious about education. Rembrandt was enrolled at the Latin school at the age of 7, which was the preparatory step for the university. His parents had ambitions for him, and those ambitions were not small. He enrolled at Leiden University in 1620, at the age of 14, which was not unusual at the time, but he did not stay. Almost immediately upon enrollment, he left to study painting. The decision was not as radical as it might sound. In the Dutch Republic of the early 17th century, painting was not a marginal occupation. It was a trade, in the full sense of the word, organized into guilds, governed by apprenticeship structures, and capable of producing a comfortable living for a man of talent. The demand for paintings among the Dutch merchant class was so enormous that artists of even modest ability could find steady work. For a young man who could already draw the way Rembrandt could draw, the decision was obvious. His parents appear to have accepted it with reasonable equanimity. They were practical people. His first teacher was a Leiden painter named Jacob van Swanenburg. Van Swanenburg was competent, which is about the kindest thing anyone has said about him. He specialized in scenes of hell and the underworld, tortured figures, flames, demons, the whole Catholic Baroque catalog of damnation, which was somewhat ironic for a Calvinist country that had rejected most of that theological architecture. But Van Swanenburg could handle paint. He knew the fundamentals. And for 3 years, Rembrandt studied under him and learned them. What Van Swanenburg gave him was foundation. What he gave himself, in the hundreds of hours of drawing and observation that characterize every serious apprenticeship, was something harder to name, a way of seeing, not just recording what was in front of him, but understanding it, understanding the structure of a face, the way muscle and bone and skin interact, the way light behaves differently on different materials, the way a hand tells you everything about the person it belongs to, if you know how to look. After 3 years with Van Swanenburg, his father sent him to Amsterdam to study with a painter named Peter Lastman. This was a different matter entirely. Peter Lastman was the most important history painter in Amsterdam in the early 17th century. History painting in this context meant something specific. Paintings that told stories drawn from the Bible, from classical mythology, from ancient history. They were the highest prestige genre in European art, requiring not just technical skill, but narrative intelligence, the ability to compress a complex story into a single frozen moment and make that moment speak. Lastman had studied in Italy. He had seen Caravaggio. He had absorbed the lessons of the Roman and Venetian masters, and he had brought those lessons back to Amsterdam and applied them with intelligence and considerable craft. Rembrandt studied with Lastman for 6 months. Only 6 months. But those 6 months changed everything. What Lastman gave him was the key to Caravaggio's discovery. That light was not just a technical tool for modeling form. Light was the primary subject of painting. Light was drama. Light was emotion. Light, deployed correctly, could make a painted figure seem to breathe. Rembrandt returned to Leiden in 1622 and set up his own studio. He was 16 years old. The paintings he produced in Leiden in the 1620s are already extraordinary. They are not yet fully Rembrandt. They are the work of a young man who has absorbed a great deal very quickly and is experimenting with tremendous energy and confidence. But you can already see what is coming. You can see it in the way he uses shadow. In other painters of the period, shadow is what you paint where the light isn't. It's neutral. It's background. In the young Rembrandt, shadow is already a presence in its own right. Dense, warm, alive with the suggestion of things that aren't fully seen. His shadows don't erase things. They hide them, which is different. And in hiding them, they invite you to lean forward. You can also see it in the faces. Even in his earliest works, Rembrandt's faces are individuated in a way that other painters' faces are not. They are not types, not old man, not young woman, not Roman soldier. They are specific people, caught in specific moments, thinking specific thoughts that you can almost hear if you look long enough. In 1625, at the age of 19, he painted a work called The Stoning of St. Stephen. It's a large, ambitious composition, crowded, energetic, full of the kind of theatrical gesture that Lastman had taught him. But in the lower left corner, almost as an afterthought, there is a face that stops you cold, a young man watching the execution. His expression is impossible to categorize. It is neither sorrow, nor horror, nor indifference, but something compound and human that has no single name. That face is almost certainly a self-portrait, the first of dozens. He was 19 years old, and he was already asking the question that would define his entire career. What does a face actually contain? He shared his Leiden studio during these years with a painter named Jan Levens, who was 1 year younger than Rembrandt, and equally, many thought more, talented. Levens was brilliant, fluent, confident, technically dazzling. A visiting Dutch diplomat named Constantijn Huygens, who was one of the sharpest cultural observers of the era, visited their studio in 1628 and was astonished by both of them. He wrote a long account of the visit in his memoirs, praising their gifts in terms that bordered on rapture. He noted that both young men could not be persuaded to visit Italy, as every serious artist of the period was expected to do, because, they said, there were enough Italian paintings in Dutch collections to study. They didn't need to travel. They were confident enough, or arrogant enough, to believe they could learn what Italy had to teach without actually going there. Huygens had a specific observation about the difference between them. Levens, he wrote, had grandeur of conception and boldness of invention. Rembrandt had something that Huygens found harder to name: a penetrating quality, a depth of feeling in his subjects that Leavens, for all his gifts, did not quite reach. Huygens was right. Leavens was a great talent. Rembrandt was a different order of thing entirely. The difference would become clear in time, as it always does. In 1631, Rembrandt moved to Amsterdam. He was 25 years old. He had outgrown Leiden, not as a talent. He had outgrown it as a market. Amsterdam was where the money was, and the money was where the commissions were, and the commissions were what an ambitious young painter needed to build a career, a reputation, and a life. Amsterdam in 1631 was the wealthiest city in the world. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had established trade routes to Asia, Africa, and the Americas that were generating profits on a scale that had no precedent in European commerce. The city had grown in 30 years from a modest regional port into a metropolis of 200,000 people, crisscrossed by canals, lined with the tall, narrow townhouses of merchants who had made fortunes in spices, textiles, ships, and finance. These merchants wanted portraits. They wanted themselves painted, and their wives, and their children, and their guild colleagues. They wanted the evidence of their existence rendered in oil on canvas and hung in rooms where their success was visible. They were not primarily interested in art as spiritual transcendence. They were interested in art as record and as status, and they were willing to pay for quality. Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam with an introduction to an art dealer named Hendrik Eulenburg, a shrewd entrepreneur who had built a business supplying paintings to the merchant market. Eulenburg ran what was essentially a painting workshop and retail operation. He employed artists, handled commissions, sold work to collectors, and took a cut of everything. He recognized in Rembrandt something he had not seen before in any of the painters who passed through his establishment. He gave him lodgings in his house and an introduction to every significant collector in the city. The results were immediate and spectacular. Within months of arriving in Amsterdam, Rembrandt was the most sought-after portrait painter in the city. Within a year, he was the most celebrated. The reason was simple. He did something with portraits that no one else was doing. He made them honest. Portrait painting in the 17th century was a flattering art. You hired a portrait painter to be made to look good, dignified, prosperous, authoritative. The painter was paid to present the best possible version of you in the most favorable possible light. Wrinkles were softened. Double chins were suggested rather than stated. Expressions were composed into attitudes of calm command. Rembrandt did not do this. Or rather, he did it, technically. His subjects look dignified and prosperous. They are well-dressed, well-lit, well-composed. But in their eyes, in the precise, terrifying specificity of their eyes, there is something else, a whole inner life, visible, the anxiety beneath the confidence, the grief beneath the composure, the specific, irreducible personhood of the individual sitting in front of him. You look at a Rembrandt portrait, and you feel you are being introduced to someone. You look at almost anyone else's portraits from the same period, and you feel you are looking at a category. In 1632, the year after his arrival in Amsterdam, Rembrandt produced what would become his first great public triumph, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp. This was a commission from the Amsterdam Guild of Surgeons, who wanted a group portrait of their members, observing a public dissection. Group portraits were a Dutch speciality, called schutterstukken when they depicted civic guards, regentenstukken when they depicted the governors of civic institutions. They were notoriously difficult to paint well, because each sitter was paying for the commission, and each sitter expected to be given appropriate prominence. The result, in less skilled hands, was almost always a painting that looked like a row of faces, all competing for the same corner of the canvas. Rembrandt solved the problem by doing something no one had done before. He made the group portrait into a drama. The 7 men surrounding Dr. Tulp are not simply sitting for their portraits. They are engaged. They are leaning in, pulling back, exchanging glances. Some are looking at the dissected arm. Some are looking at the book. 2 are looking directly at the viewer, with an expression that suggests they are aware they are being watched, watching something that was not meant to be watched. The dead body on the table, a criminal named Adrian Zoon, executed for theft, is painted with such anatomical precision and such emotional weight that it becomes the moral center of the entire composition. These men are brilliant and learned, the painting says, and they are studying a corpse. These 2 facts are not in conflict. They are inseparable. The painting was a sensation. Amsterdam had not seen anything like it. The technical skill was extraordinary, but that was almost beside the point. What Amsterdam was responding to was the emotional intelligence of the work, the feeling that a painting had somehow told the truth about something difficult and real. Rembrandt was 26 years old. He was famous. The years that followed were years of accumulation, of wealth, of reputation, of students, of work, and of something else that mattered at least as much as any of those things. In Hendrik Uylenburg's household, Rembrandt met a woman named Saskia van Eilenburg. She was Hendrik's niece, the daughter of a wealthy Frisian merchant and former mayor named Rombertus van Eilenburg. She was well educated, well connected, and by the portraits Rembrandt would later make of her, beautiful in a way that was particular to her face. Not conventionally beautiful, not the idealized oval of the period's preferred aesthetic, but vivid and alive and radiant with a quality that Rembrandt clearly found inexhaustible. They became engaged in 1633 and married in 1634. The years of their marriage, 1634 to 1642, are the years of Rembrandt's greatest worldly success. He bought a large townhouse on the Sint-Antonisbreestraat in 1639, one of the most fashionable streets in the city. He filled it with an astonishing collection of art and curiosities, paintings by Raphael, Rubens, and Levens, Roman busts and Greek helmets and Japanese armor, shells and coral and natural specimens, Turkish fabrics and Venetian glass. He was a collector with the appetite of a man who believes he will always have the means to collect. He had a studio full of the most talented students in Amsterdam, including men who would themselves become significant painters: Ferdinand Bol, Govert Flinck, Nicolaes Mies. He received commissions from the most powerful men in Dutch society. He painted the stadholder's secretary. He painted Amsterdam's most successful lawyers and merchants and scholars. And he painted Saskia over and over and over again, in formal portraits and intimate studies, dressed as the goddess Flora, crowned with flowers, lying in bed, ill, laughing on his knee in a tavern scene, resting in a window, in drawings made in the margin of whatever was at hand. He was a man who looked at his wife the way a painter looks at the world, as something inexhaustible, something that would always yield another detail, another truth, if you were willing to keep looking. They had 4 children. 3 died in infancy. The 4th, a son named Titus, born in 1641, survived. Saskia did not. She died on June 14th, 1642. She was 29 years old. The cause was tuberculosis, the disease that consumed lives in the 17th century, with a democratic indifference to wealth and talent and youth. Titus was 14 months old. Rembrandt was 35. The world continued to make its demands on him. It did not pause. In the same year that Saskia died, 1642, Rembrandt completed what would become the most famous painting in the history of Dutch art, The Night Watch. It is important to say something about what the Night Watch actually is, because it has been surrounded for so long by mythology and misrepresentation that the painting itself sometimes gets lost. It is not, despite what you may have read, a painting of a night patrol. The original title, given to it long after Rembrandt's death, reflects an error. Centuries of varnish had darkened it so severely that people assumed it depicted a nighttime scene. When it was cleaned in the 20th century, it turned out to be a daytime scene. The golden light is Rembrandt's invention, not a concession to darkness. What it actually depicts is a company of Amsterdam civic guards, a militia group called the Company of Captain Frans Banink Kok, assembling for a march. It was a standard commission for such groups, the same type of group portrait that other painters had been executing for decades. Each militiaman contributed to the cost of the painting and expected to be prominently represented in it. What Rembrandt delivered was not what they expected. The painting is enormous, nearly 12 feet tall and 14 feet wide in its current form, and it was even larger before it was cut down in the 18th century to fit a new hanging space. It is a scene of barely controlled chaos, figures emerging from shadow, drums beating, flags unfurling, a dog barking, a girl carrying a dead chicken, a man loading a musket. The composition has the quality of a moment caught rather than posed, a freeze frame from something that was actually happening. Technically, it is the most ambitious painting Rembrandt had yet attempted. The management of light alone, the way he illuminates Captain Kok and his lieutenant at the center, while pushing other figures into deep shadow, the way the little girl in yellow seems to glow with her own internal light amid the surrounding darkness, represents a level of pictorial intelligence that no one in Amsterdam or anywhere else could have matched. But some of the militiamen were not pleased. They had paid for a group portrait. They had received a history painting. Some of them were barely visible. Some were in shadow. One face, at least one, was almost entirely obscured. The story, which has been told and retold and embellished with every retelling, is that the commission was a disaster, that Rembrandt's reputation never recovered from it, that the failure of the Night Watch was the beginning of his decline. This story is almost entirely false. The Night Watch was controversial. Some of the militiamen were probably disappointed, but there is no evidence of a public scandal. There is no record of the painting being rejected or Rembrandt being censured. His career continued after 1642. He continued to receive commissions. he continued to paint important works. What changed in 1642 was not his public reputation. What changed was Saskia. What changed was everything that mattered. Saskia's death left Rembrandt with a baby son, a large house full of expensive things he could not afford, and a will that contained a provision he would spend the next decade trying to navigate around. Saskia had left her estate to Titus. This was standard practice in the period. But the will included a clause stating that if Rembrandt remarried, he would forfeit his right to use the income from the estate. It was a clause designed to protect the child's inheritance from a hypothetical future stepmother. It was a clause that would constrain every subsequent relationship Rembrandt entered into. It was a clause that, combined with his spectacular financial mismanagement, would help destroy him. In the years immediately following Saskia's death, Rembrandt employed a woman named Geertje Dirks as a nurse and housekeeper, primarily to care for the infant Titus. Geertje was a widow, a woman of modest circumstances, and she and Rembrandt became lovers. He gave her gifts, including jewelry that had belonged to Saskia. She appears to have believed, with some justification, that this constituted a promise of marriage. The relationship deteriorated. By the late 1640s, a younger woman named Hendrikje Stoffels had entered the household. Hendrikje was 20 years younger than Rembrandt. She was born around 1626, and she would remain with him for the rest of her life. She was, by everything we can reconstruct, a woman of considerable intelligence, practical competence, and extraordinary loyalty. She never married him. Couldn't, because of Saskia's will. She was summoned before the Reformed Church Council in 1654 and censured for living in sin with Rembrandt. She attended the hearing alone. Rembrandt did not accompany her. The Geertje situation was uglier. In 1649, Geertje sued Rembrandt for breach of promise. The case went to arbitrators, who awarded her an annual payment. The following year, Rembrandt had her committed to a house of correction, what we would today call an asylum. In Gouda, the documentary evidence suggests he was actively involved in the process. He appears to have used the legal system to remove a woman who had become inconvenient to him. This is not a comfortable part of the story. It is part of the story nonetheless. We will return to it. Through the 1640s and into the 1650s, Rembrandt's financial situation deteriorated steadily toward catastrophe. The reasons were multiple and reinforcing. He had paid too much for his house. He had borrowed heavily and irregularly, against expectations of income that did not always materialize. His collecting habit, the paintings, the armor, the curiosities, the prints, had accelerated rather than slowed as his income became less reliable, and his taste in work had evolved in directions that the Amsterdam market did not always follow. The Amsterdam that had made him famous in 1632 had different tastes by 1650. The city's merchant class was trending toward lighter, smoother, more refined paintings. The kind of work produced by painters like Gerard Terborch and Gabriel Metsu, whose elegant domestic interiors were precisely the kind of art that Rembrandt had never been and could not become. Even some of his own former students, Ferdinand Bol, Govert Flink, were receiving commissions that should by rights have gone to their teacher. Rembrandt responded to this shift in the market, the way he responded to everything, by going deeper into himself. The paintings of the 1650s are the most psychologically complex, the most technically daring, and the least commercially appealing. Of his career, the paint becomes thicker, more impastoed, applied with tools other than brushes, palette knives, rags, sometimes. Apparently, his fingers. The shadows deepen. The faces grow more weighted, more interior. The drama becomes less theatrical and more meditative. Amsterdam looked at these paintings and was not sure what to do with them. They were too dark, too rough, too unfinished looking, even though they were in fact more finished, more considered, more intentional than anything that hung next to them. In 1656, Rembrandt was declared insolvent. The formal Dutch term was cessio bonorum, a surrender of goods. He applied for it himself, which in the Dutch legal system of the period was a somewhat more dignified option than a full bankruptcy. It meant his creditors could be paid from the liquidation of his assets, without him being imprisoned for debt. It meant his house would be sold. It meant everything in it would be sold. Every painting, every print, every piece of armor and curious shell and Venetian glass, everything accumulated over a career of 30 years. The inventory drawn up for the bankruptcy proceedings survives in the Amsterdam City Archives. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of art. Room by room, it lists the contents of the Sint-Anthonis-Briestraat house, the paintings in the entrance hall, the side room, the studio, the large back room, the small back room. It lists helmets and globes and busts. It lists clothes and furniture and household items. And it lists, in entry after entry, the works by Rembrandt himself, finished paintings, unfinished paintings, prints, drawings, studies. They were sold, all of them. The buyers paid far less than they were worth. That is what happens at bankruptcy sales. The creditors were partially compensated. Rembrandt was left with almost nothing. He was 50 years old. He would live for another 13 years. And those 13 years would produce some of the greatest paintings in human history. After the bankruptcy, Rembrandt moved to a smaller house in the Jordaan district, on the Rozengracht, the Rose Canal. It was a modest neighborhood, working class by the standards of the city, full of artisans and small traders, a long way, in every sense, from the grand house on the Sint-Anthonis-Briestraat. Hendrikje and Titus, now in his mid-teens, formed a legal arrangement to protect Rembrandt's remaining capacity to work. They created a company, with themselves as dealers, and Rembrandt as their employee. This meant that any money Rembrandt earned went to the company, not to him directly, and was therefore not subject to seizure by his old creditors. It was a practical solution, lovingly engineered by two people who could have walked away and chose not to. In the studio on the Rozengracht, Rembrandt painted. He painted biblical subjects with a weight and intimacy that had no equivalent in the work he had produced at the height of his fame. He painted Jacob wrestling with the angel, not a confrontation, as tradition depicted it, but an embrace. Jacob and the angel holding each other in something that looks less like combat and more like grief. He painted the return of the prodigal son, the father's hands on his son's shoulders, the son's face pressed into the father's chest, the surrounding figures watching, uncertain. It is not a painting about sin and redemption. It is a painting about what it feels like to be forgiven. He painted Titus, his son, who was growing up watching his father lose everything, and keep painting anyway. There are several portraits of Titus from this period, and they are among the most tender things Rembrandt ever made. One of them shows Titus at a desk, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes slightly unfocused, the expression of a person thinking something through that is too large to think through quickly. He is 17 or 18 in the painting. He looks, somehow, already old. And he painted himself, always himself. But the self-portraits of the final decade are different from everything that came before. The face in the mirror is no longer young, no longer handsome by conventional standards, no longer performing anything at all. It is simply there, looking back, with an expression that art historians have been trying to describe for 350 years and have not succeeded in adequately capturing, because the expression contains too many things simultaneously: curiosity, humor, weariness, acceptance, and something that is not quite sorrow and not quite peace, but lives somewhere between them. One of the most remarkable of the late self-portraits, now in the Kenwood House collection in London, shows Rembrandt in his late 60s, wearing a white cap and a plain dark coat, holding what appears to be a rag or a palette. The background is arranged in two large circles, geometric, abstract, unexplained. No one knows exactly what they mean. They may be a reference to Apelles, the greatest painter of classical antiquity, who is said to have drawn a perfect circle as proof of his skill. They may be something else entirely. What matters is what they do. They place the painter at the center of something larger than himself, a geometry, a cosmos, an order, and invite you to consider what that means. His expression in this portrait is one of the most complex things in the history of art. He is looking at you, but he is also looking through you, through the lens of the mirror, through the surface of the painting, through the 350 years that separate his moment from yours. He does not ask for sympathy. He does not ask for admiration. He asks, with a patience that is almost unbearable, to be seen. In 1663, Hendrikje Stoffels died. She was 37 years old. Plague was likely the cause, as it was for so many deaths in Amsterdam that year. She had been with Rembrandt for more than 15 years. She had stood before a church council to defend him. She had helped engineer the legal arrangement that allowed him to keep working. She had raised his son as if he were her own. She did not appear in any painting made after her death. He did not paint grief this time. Perhaps some griefs are beyond the reach of paint. Titus married in 1668, at the age of 27. His wife was a woman named Magdalena van Loo. Rembrandt painted them both, separately, and together in studies. He was a grandfather-to-be. For a moment, it seemed as though something good might continue. Titus died in September 1668. He was 27 years old, like his mother Saskia when she died, and like Hendrikje, he was taken by illness. Again, probably plague. His wife was pregnant. His daughter, a girl named Titia, was born the following March. Rembrandt did not live to see her. Rembrandt van Rijn died on October 4th, 1669. He was 63 years old. He was buried 4 days later in a rented grave in the Westerkerk, the West Church, in Amsterdam. A rented grave, because he could not afford a permanent one. After 20 years, when the rental period expired, the grave was reused. His bones were scattered. No one knows exactly where they are. The estate left behind consisted of a few paintings, some clothes, the tools of his trade, and what the inventory called some odds and ends of no great value. The total was assessed at not quite 200 guilders. At the height of his fame, a single portrait commission had fetched several hundred guilders. He had been paid more for one painting than he left in the world. So, what did he leave? He left the paintings. He left the anatomy lesson and the night watch, which hang in Amsterdam and are among the most visited artworks in the world. He left the Return of the Prodigal Son, which hangs in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and which the novelist and theologian Henri Nouwen spent a week sitting in front of, before writing a book about it. He left Aristotle contemplating a bust of Homer, which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and which was purchased in 1961 for $2.3 million, the highest price ever paid for a painting at that time. He left the self-portraits, which are scattered across 40 or 50 museums on 4 continents, and which together constitute the most sustained meditation on human aging and identity that any artist has ever produced. He left something harder to name as well. He left a way of looking at other people, not looking at surfaces, not at clothes, not at poses, not at the social performances we all maintain in the presence of others, looking at what is underneath, looking at the specific, irreplaceable, incompletely understood interior life that every human being carries and almost never shows. Rembrandt showed it, not because he was an especially sympathetic person. He wasn't always, as the Geertje Dirks episode makes clear, not because he had a theory of the soul that other painters lacked, but because he looked with the patience and the courage that real looking requires. He looked at himself. He looked at Saskia. He looked at the old men he hired from the street to model for his biblical figures. He looked at the beggars and vagrants he sketched in the margins of his notebooks. He looked at a dead body on a dissecting table and found in it something that required both reverence and intelligence to see. The question that follows Rembrandt, as it follows every great artist whose personal life was less admirable than their work, is how to hold the two things together. The painter who saw the humanity in a pauper's face, the man who had a woman he had slept with committed to an asylum. The honest answer is that they were the same person, and that the contradiction is not a paradox to be resolved, but a fact to be held. Human beings are capable of extraordinary perception and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes in the same week, sometimes from the same person. Rembrandt was not a saint. He was not even, by the standards of his time, a particularly admirable man. He was a painter of genius who behaved badly enough in some of his personal relationships to warrant the discomfort you feel when you read about it. And the paintings are still there, and they are still what they are. And when you stand in front of the Return of the Prodigal Son and look at those two hands, one strong, one gentle, both old, resting on the shoulders of a man who has come home, you are not looking at Rembrandt the man. You are looking at something he found, or made, or discovered in himself. Something about what forgiveness feels like from the inside. You will have to decide for yourself what to do with that. What I can tell you is this: no other painter in the history of Western art has looked at the human face with as much patience, as much honesty, or as much love, even imperfect, even compromised, even damaged love, as Rembrandt van Rijn. He painted darkness, not because he was a dark man, though some part of him was, but because he understood that light only means something when there is darkness to emerge from, that a face only tells you the truth when you can see what is hidden behind it, that a life only becomes legible when you are willing to sit with its shadows as well as its illuminations. He sat with his own for 63 years, and he painted them, all of them, without flattering himself, without looking away, with a courage that most of us, if we are honest, do not fully possess. This has been Art and Ashes. If this story kept you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, which Rembrandt, the triumphant young painter of the anatomy lesson, the grieving husband who lost Saskia, the bankrupt survivor of the Rosengracht years, or the old man with the white cap looking back at you from the mirror, feels most real to you tonight? And tell us what story you want us to tell next. Every comment gets read, every single one. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.